Thank you, Plummen, for this kind introduction, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. So I'm going to be talking about a sort of novel approach to measuring culture and measuring cultural distances between population groups using data from Facebook. This is a collaborative study between groups of different researchers, mainly in Madrid, at SMU, where I am currently, and at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. So let me just sort of start. I mean, probably for this audience, it's not very important to convince you that culture has been fundamental to human evolution. It's at the end of the day what sets our species apart from the rest of the animal world, and it's what has allowed humans to settle and colonize the planet, right? And so culture, as such, is of interest to a wide variety of fields, including anthropology, sociology, political science, economics, psychology, and philosophy. In the fields that I'm a little bit more familiar with, that is economics and political science, but then culture is central to our understanding of economic development, the incidence of conflict, and also it's fundamental to our understanding of trade flows between countries, investment flows between countries, technology diffusion across populations, etc. Now, of course, in terms of definition, what exactly do we mean by culture? There's lots of definitions out there. We will be thinking of culture in a very broad sense. And so maybe let me use that second definition on the slide, which says that culture in its broadest sense is that which is socially rather than genetically transmitted. In its totality, it is that which distinguishes one human group from another. So we'll sort of think of population groups. What are the characteristics that set one population group apart from another population group? And that whole, that sort of comprehensive set of features or characteristics, that's what we will refer to as culture. And so how has culture traditionally been measured? I would say there's two main approaches, or there have been two main approaches. One is the ethnographic approach. The ethnographic approach, as you know, sort of consists of ethnographers who essentially go and observe different population groups. They kind of sit around there, maybe for months, even for years, just observing different populations. And when they do so, they try to describe these populations in a very holistic, comprehensive way. The descriptions tend to be very rich and detailed, and they very much take what I would call a revealed preferences bottom-up approach, meaning they try not to have any prejudices about what is important and what is not important. They just describe whatever tends to be characteristic of these populations, right? And so the bottom-up idea is the idea that I just go and observe, and whatever I observe is what I end up describing. So there's a lot of great advantages to this ethnographic approach, but it of course also comes with some disadvantages, and the main disadvantage is that it's of course very time consuming and costly, right? I mean, if an ethnographer has to sit for months or maybe even for a year to describe one population, that makes this approach difficult to scale, and so it's very costly and time consuming. Of course, the other approach, let me skip some slides here. The other approach is to use surveys, right? And so you ask people, surveys ask people a set of questions aimed at measuring people's values or norms or whatever they think, population cultures. Um, and so that has the advantage that it's somewhat more scalable, of course. You don't need to sit for a whole year to observe a particular population. It's more scalable, it's quantifiable, it has a well thought out design questionnaire. So many great advantages to running surveys. Uh, Yet it is still actually quite time consuming and costly, right? Of course, much less costly than the ethnographer's approach, but still costly, right? So, for example, the best known survey maybe is the World Values Survey. Well, they would tend to survey in each country, say between 1,000 and 3,000 people, and they would do this every 3-4 years. uh, and so it's still somewhat time consuming and costly. For example, it's hard to use the World Value Survey at subnational level, right? Suppose I want to do work at the level of cities, or I want to do work at the level of different subnational regions. It would be hard to use the World Value Survey just because you would pretty quickly run into small sample issues. It also has possibly, I mean, I don't know if you would view this as a disadvantage, but it has more of a top-down approach, right? Because of course the survey has been designed by a group of social scientists. Of course, a very well-designed survey, but it does mean that it doesn't include necessarily everything that is of interest of people. So for instance, the World Value Survey doesn't ask any questions about people's sports preferences. It doesn't ask any questions about people's culinary tastes. Well, maybe because it's not important, but maybe it is important, and they just decided not to ask those questions. Um, so that's the survey approach. Uh, and so what we will do in this paper is we will use data on Facebook interests to measure culture. Uh, and we will sort of we will call this approach a computational ethnography approach. Why ethnography? Well, because we will be we will be taking the approach that whatever is of interest to people is fine, right? We're not going to say, okay, people, we're only going to look at these particular subjects. Whatever people spend time on, whatever people find interesting, is what we're going to be measuring, right? And so, in that sense, it takes this holistic, bottom-up revealed preference approach, similar to the ethnographies, similar to ethnography, and it's computational. The word computation is not really about computing here, but it's about the fact that it's going to be using massive amounts of data. So of course, the first thing I'll need to do in this talk is explain to you what exactly this means. Then the second thing is I will want to validate this approach, because you could very easily say, oh, this sounds interesting. It's pretty exciting, but I don't know exactly what this means. What exactly are you measuring? Should I really call this culture, or is this some totally different animal? So we will spend a lot of time on validation. And then the third point is about suggesting ways in which these data can be used to answer important questions in the social sciences. And depending on the time I have, I may actually keep some of what is described in point 3 as part of the discussion, right? So I'm going to focus mainly on trying to convince you that this is a reasonable approach for measuring culture, right? And then in the discussion, if you want to know more about how can these data be used, we can expand a bit on this third point. Okay, so how do we measure culture using Facebook interests? So as you know, Facebook is an online social network platform. It has close to 3 billion users. And so one thing that Facebook does is if you have a Facebook account, you will have a profile. And within that profile, there will be a series of identifiers of things that are of interest to you. These are things that Facebook has detected as topics that might be of interest to you. And so how does Facebook go about assigning interests to users? It's not just about you explicitly liking something, but it's also whatever you click on, whatever you share, whatever you open and you read, whatever essentially Facebook observes all of your activity, right? And again, it's whatever you happen to be spending your time on. It will sort of identify topics or subjects that you might find interesting. And by the way, it doesn't only do that when you are on Facebook itself, but it also observes you whenever you are on a web page to which Facebook in one way or another has access to. And that's about 30% of the worldwide 30% of the World Wide Web. It also observes a lot of the things you do when you are actually offline. So it's not just about when you're explicitly on Facebook that they observe you, but suppose you're someone who goes jogging every day, and you have an app that tracks, how fast you run or where you run or whatever, or your GPS location. As soon as that app has some kind of connection with Facebook, Facebook knows where you are, right? And so if they notice that every day you go for a walk in the forest, they will probably say that you're someone who likes that. Or if you go every single night to the same pub, Facebook would know that just through your GPS location. So they try to identify what is of interest to you. And what's important to understand here is that their whole business model is based on trying to correctly infer and identify those interests. Because the better they identify those interests, the better they can feed you with news or information that is appealing to you. And the more that happens, the more time you will spend on the platform, and the more time you spend on the platform, the more they can show ads to you, right? So Facebook makes money of ads. To show ads, you need to spend time on Facebook. In order for you to spend time on Facebook, Facebook must be of some interest to you. To make Facebook more interesting to you, Facebook tries to show you stuff that might be interesting to you, right? That's kind of the business model. And so their algorithm is all about correctly identifying those interests. Are they always successful at it? Obviously not. But the point is they're using the universe of all the things you do and all the information they get to try to identify this in the best possible way, right? And so from that point of view, we sort of say that Facebook acts like an unseen or unobservable ethnographer. It's essentially following you around, and it's observing whatever you happen to be doing, right? So it's important that it's a very comprehensive, holistic kind of approach here, because some people might say, yeah, but people try to give a certain image of themselves on Facebook, which is not their true self. Well, that may be true if you say, okay, I'm going to put some pictures of myself looking very happy, even if I'm not in a very good mood. But that's not what this is about. It's about Facebook observing, again, what you click on, what you happen to be reading, what you spend time on, etc., etc. Okay, so then how do we define these potential interests? So we started out with all the Wikipedia titles in the English Wikipedia version. We took all the words in the English dictionary. So you have thousands of, essentially you have thousands of concepts here. And for each one of these, we queried or we fed these terms, let's say, into Facebook's marketing API, right? So what is this marketing API? This marketing API of Facebook is a system that Facebook uses for advertisers. So suppose that you live in Madrid and you want to open up a Mexican restaurant and you want to make publicity on Facebook, you can go to the marketing API and say, look, I want to know how many Facebook users are interested in Mexican food in these particular zip codes or in this particular city. And then Facebook will say, okay, there's 13,000 people in Madrid interested in Mexican food. And if you want to advertise to these 13,000 people, this is how much we're going to charge you, right? And so the first thing is to say what are the interests we want to ask. Well, we don't know what people's interests are, so we feed all possible terms into this search function. That gives us back 400,000 interests, and then out of these 400,000 interests, we kept the 60,000 that have a global audience of more than 500,000. So then we have 60,000 terms. One could be Mexican food, for example, but many others. We have 60,000 terms. And then for each one of these 60,000, we say, how many people in Spain like Mexican food? How many people in the US like Mexican food? How many people in Bulgaria like Mexican food, right? And for each one of these queries, Facebook returns us numbers. 13,000 in Spain, 1 million in Bulgaria, whatever, right? So all these numbers. And so we started out doing this for 220 countries and 60,000 interests. So think of this as a matrix of 12 million, about 12 million cells, right? 12 million elements. So we essentially queried the Facebook marketing API 12 million times. And for each one of these 12 million queries, we got numbers of users interested in all these 60,000 different topics for these 200 countries. So again, we started with countries, but you can do this with a subnational regions. You can do it for different subpopulations. You can split up the population by age. You can split up the population by gender. You could do this at the level of cities. There's many things you can do. We started with countries, but there's also some things I can show you for other types of population groups. So that's the methodology, right? So it's very holistic in the sense that, well, we have these 60,000 interests. It's really many different things. It's all kinds of stuff. You know, it could be, of course, religion, morals, but food, drink, sports, perfume, whatever, children, spirituality, and it pretty much anything you can think of is in there. Everything you can think of is in there. And as I said, it's this revealed preference approach, because we don't take any stance on what should people find interesting. We don't know what interests people. We don't know. So we just let people tell us what they find interesting. So this is very scalable. It's in some sense close to costless, except for the fact that, you know, we did need some computer scientists on our team to be able to automize these queries rather than doing this manually and being able to do this 10 times or 100 times. Doing this 12 million times did require some skill, but the data are there, right? And so in that sense, it's it's scalable, and it's almost costless. By the way, important to mention, because whenever you work on Facebook, people get nervous about privacy issues. So there's no privacy issues here. Everything is at the level of population groups, right? So again, how many people are interested in Buddha in Venezuela, right? So it's not about whether Plamen likes a particular thing or Klaus likes something else. It's never at the individual level. That's, by the way, why we also just can use the public platform available on Facebook to access these data. I mean, we did not need to ask any type of special permission to do this. Okay, and so once you have this matrix, right, of let's say 60,000 rows and 200 columns, you can calculate distances between the vectors of interests. And so we use the cosine distance to measure distances between these vectors of interest as a measure of a cultural distance between populations. So you could say, what is the distance between Spain and Portugal? What is the distance between Japan and Argentina, etc., etc. Okay, so let me show you some stuff now. This starts getting into the validation, and I realize I don't have too much time. So let me just talk about 10 minutes about validation, and then we can open up to some discussion. So let me just first show you. Sorry. Let me see this. Okay, so let me just show you a few examples, just so you see that that this is more or less reasonable. So this is the share of Facebook users by country interested in the Bible, right? So you see strong presence in South America, some areas in sub-Saharan Africa, the US, etc. Almost absence in most of Asia. You go to Allah, well, you see obviously North Africa, the Middle East, etc. Much less of a presence in, say, South America. This is Buddha. Well, you get more of a presence in South and East Asia. This is soccer. These are just examples, just to show you, right? I mean, this is nothing fancy here, but this is share of Facebook users interested in soccer, right? So very little in North America, not that much in Asia, much stronger in South America, not surprising. Rugby, you see Australia popping up there, for example. And these are other examples. Okay, pizza is here, for example. Okay, so you see Italy and Argentina, of course, as some examples. Tacos, a lot in Mexico and North America. Sauerkraut, this is more Eastern European, right? So these are just examples of the types of of interests that we have, and that you might say, okay, this kind of looks the way I would expect it. I would expect it to look. This is capitalism, Marxism, interest in Putin, interest in Trump. You see, so that it's just more or less, I mean, I won't keep going here, but it seems kind of reasonable if you just look at these numbers. Now, so then a second thing we did is, okay, let us take these Facebook-based measures of cultural distances between country pairs, right? And let's simply correlate them with different measures of genetic distance, religious distance, geographic distance, linguistic distance, and cultural distance, where here the cultural distance, the first 4 bars over here, these cultural distances are world value survey based differences. And so the first thing you see on this graph is that our Facebook based measures of distances are positively correlated with all these differences. or with all these distances, but in particular or most strongly, they are correlated with world value survey based distances between countries. So we thought that was good news, right? Because not necessarily that we say that the world value survey is sort of uh, the optimal, but if we believe this measures something similar to cultural distances, we would like to see positive correlations with world value survey based distances. If you do uh, if you do say partial correlations, so if you go, for example, to panel B here, if you do partial correlation, which would mean I'm going to correlate, say, Facebook-based distances with either cultural distances or genetic distances or geographical distances, etc., controlling for all other distances, then again you see that the cultural distances, which are the world value survey based distances, are the ones that come out the most strong in terms of correlations. So we thought that was good, and of course we do lots of robustness checks here, trying to deal with issues of representativeness and how representative are the Facebook data, etc., etc. Then we also did some cluster analysis. This is for a subset of countries. I mean, here are all the countries, but it's kind of hard to see. So the first graph here is on a subset of countries, and actually it's a subset of countries that coincides with countries of the World Value Survey. And so this is hierarchical clustering. So we take the matrix of Facebook-based distances, and we say if we had to cluster countries together, how would that clustering look like? And so just to give you an example, if you look at the gray countries here, the United States joins Canada at the lowest level. Then at the next level, right, this is like a tree diagram, right? At the next level, it joins with the cluster of New Zealand and Australia. At the next level, it joins United Kingdom and Ireland. At the next level, Iceland. And then once you go up to the further level, then it actually joins all of Northwest Europe, right? Pretty much all of Western Europe, I would say, right? So the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, and then most of Western Europe here. So this is all very reasonable, right? This is kind of what you would expect. The red ones, for example, the Latin American cluster. Portugal is in here as well, which joins Brazil. That's probably a linguistic issue, right? And so you look at these examples, and what you see is actually quite reasonable. Here you have all countries. So if you missed, for example, Bulgaria is not in here, but Bulgaria is in the next one. It's a little bit harder to see, but Bulgaria joins Romania at the lowest level, for instance. And so you can see it's a mix. You say, oh, that's just geography. That's a mix of geography and other things, right? Because say when I gave you the example of the US, it's maybe more of a cultural, some kind of linguistic thing. So it's a mix of different links here, which we could denominate culture. You can do the same thing at the level of subnational regions. So this is done for the US states. And what's really interesting is you see some of the sort of standard cultural clusters that have been described by anthropologists. So for example, the purple ones here at the bottom, this is kind of the deep South, right? Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, etc. You also have in gray up here the entire Midwest. So these are the standard cultural clusters that people have observed in the US. But then there's also some examples that show that it's not purely about geography. So, for example, you see that the urban states of the East Coast, such as Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, they actually end up joining some of the West Coast, like California, But then if I look at the green cluster over here, the rural states of the East Coast like Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine, they end up clustering with Montana, Wyoming, Alaska. These are more rural mountainous states in other parts of the country. So it's very interesting. Part of it is geography. Some of these standard cultural clusters that people have described, but it's more complicated than just say, oh, there's the East Coast, there's the West Coast, there's the South, and there's the Midwest. It's a little more interesting than that. You can do the same thing at the level of California counties, and again, you will find reasonable results. These are cultural distances across European regions. These are the distances between subnational regions and the national average. So for example, look, you see here, this very clearly East Germany being different from the rest of the country, right? In Spain, you have the Catalan region. In Italy, you have southern Italy and Sicily. That's different from the rest. So it all kind of makes more or less sense, and it in terms of face validity, it's all very reasonable. Okay, so let me just spend 2-3 minutes on applications, and then we can maybe open up the floor for discussion. So some of the applications that we have worked on in the paper are applications related to the following questions. One is, do national borders reflect cultural borders? So that question is kind of asking, is there something like national culture? And the reason why we were interested in this is, in the European context, for instance, you might say, hey, Europe is a very integrated place. Might it be that Madrid is actually more similar to Paris than to other regions in Spain? Or might it be that Catalonia is more similar to some region in southern France than to southern Spain? These types of questions, right? What we actually find is that by and large, national borders are very important. So we kind of find evidence very much in favor of this idea that there is something like a national culture. Then we can look at a question such as, how culturally uniform are countries, right? So this has to do with cultural heterogeneity across or between some national regions, right? How heterogeneous is a country culturally speaking when we compare different subnational regions? A third one is, can we identify particular cultural regions within a country? So for example, we did an exercise where we took Germany and said, okay, if we take Germany, and if we split up Germany in 2 or 3 or 4 groups of regions, what would those regions be? And so when we use such type of clustering algorithm, for instance, we found a very nice division between Eastern Germany and Western Germany. We did a similar exercise for India and also found some very interesting divisions between the regions that speak Dravidian languages and the regions that speak Indo-European languages. So now one other exercise we did, and this was to some degree to have some fun, was what is the cultural center of the world, right? And there the question we wanted to ask is the following: if everyone on the planet had to meet in one country, which country would minimize the total sum of the cultural distance that everybody would have to travel? So similar to, let's say, geographic center of the world, where we would use kilometers, right, geographic distance. Here we do the same exercise where we say we're all going to meet in one place, but rather than minimizing the total sum of geographic distance traveled, let's minimize the total sum of cultural distance traveled. And we actually found, that the cultural center of the world, if you do that exercise, is South Africa, right? Interesting. I mean, it is obviously a country with a big percentage of Black African population, but it also has a strong European based population, has a strong Asian population, I mean. And so we thought that was interesting. And then, of course, you can use some of these measures to look at political outcomes. So, for example, we took some results we have on cultural distances of California counties or between California counties, and we looked at whether bigger distances to the average also get translated into different voting behavior. So that was another exercise we did. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is, in addition to, say, looking at differences between countries or subnational regions, etc., we've also done some work looking at differences between genders. For example, you could compare men and women in different countries, and you could ask the same type of questions, right? You could say, are French men and French women more similar or more different than French men and Spanish men, for example, right? And so you can compare all these types of distances. It could be quite interesting. So I'm going to stop here and let Plamen take over, so he can organize the rest of the discussion. I'm happy to expand on any of these applications. I have some slides on them if you want to.